Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to the Irish-Hellenic Society. I trust you've had some time in the sun today. It was one of the most beautiful November days that I can ever recall, and the sun was shining beautifully at an angle to the world. A very beautiful place to be, Ireland, at this time of the year on such a lovely day. On the 18th of June this year, the Irish-Hellenic Society's annual outing was to Birr Castle. And for that as well, we had a beautiful sunny day. And I think I mentioned on the bus on the way in, somebody called Adomnán. And we're exceptionally lucky this evening to have somebody who is qualified in so many ways to talk about St. Adomnán. Jim Houlihan is a native of Birr, and Birr, as you know, is the omphalos of Ireland. It's the navel stone of Ireland. It's right in the centre of Ireland. It has a kind of a continental climate. It's very, very, very warm in the summer and very, very chilly in the winter. Jim worked all his life as a solicitor. He was the state solicitor for County Offaly, and then, lucky man, he decided to go off to UCD and do a doctorate. And the subject of his doctorate is on what he's going to be talking to us tonight. That has now been published by Four Courts Press, I think in the middle of COVID, I'm right in saying. And for the rest of us, Jim is also producing a smaller book, which will be of a less specialist nature for those of us who haven't been Chief State Solicitor in County Offaly and who don't understand the legal terminology. And it's a great pleasure to ask Jim to talk to us for a while, and then if you have questions, maybe to see if we can field some questions. And then I'd like to also just fix in Greek terms maybe some interesting facts about what was going on in the period. The key date, I think, is 697 AD. So cast your minds back to that kind of thing, and we'll try and figure out what was going on then in 697. I think Saint Columba had died a century previously, and the Vikings were going to arrive a century after that. But other than that, I will leave it to Dr. Jim Houlihan. You're very, very welcome, and thank you ever so much for agreeing to speak to us. And since asking you to do so, both you and your wife have contracted COVID and survived it very, very, very thankfully. So we're delighted that you've come through COVID and are able to speak to us this evening, Jim. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paddy, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you here this evening. Thank you for asking me in the first place. And of course, it's a great honor to be asked to speak to the Irish-Hellenic Society. So I'll just tell you briefly, more or less, what you've already been told about myself. I'll introduce myself. Jim Houlihan is the name. I'm a retired solicitor from Birr, County Offaly. I practiced for about 45 years or so in this locality. And I've always been very interested in history of one kind or another. And in the, I suppose, early 1990s, I became aware that the law of the innocents was in fact promulgated in Birr, my own town. So its 1300th anniversary was due to crop up in 1997. So we formed a committee and we organized a very successful celebration. But at that time and after that, I said to myself, if I'm lucky enough to be in a position to do so, I would really like to study up this law and become, to some degree at any rate, an authority on it. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do an MA, first of all, in UCD the couple of years before I retired, and I subsequently did a PhD. And the focus of my PhD really was to place this law in the history of the laws of war, and in particular those laws which sought to protect civilians in times of conflict. So that basically is where I'm coming from on this. So what was the law of the innocents? I'm assuming that most of you probably don't really know anything at all about it, and maybe never have heard of it before, but we'll go through all that. When and where was it made? What did it say? What were its terms? Who wrote it and why? What was Birr like at the time, and who attended at Birr when it was proclaimed? Are there more similar laws from outside of Ireland? What was its significance for its time? And most importantly, what is its significance for the modern world? These questions are many. You may think that it could not be possible to answer them, relating as they do to an event that happened in 697 over 1300 years ago. Although, of course, I am conscious of the fact that 697 is probably relatively recent as far as you members of the Hellenic Society are concerned. So you will have no difficulty in grasping the passage of time. The quite remarkable fact is that all of these questions can be answered from a study of surviving historical sources that have come down to us through the centuries. These sources are quoted in detail in my book, the one that Paddy has referred to. So I'm not going to go into them here, but I just want to make it clear that when I will say when I am speculating, and I will say when I'm using my imagination. But apart from that, everything else that I will be telling you has undergone rigorous academic analysis. So what we will do, hopefully, is we will visit Birr in 697. I will introduce Adomnán to you, a very, very remarkable man. We'll have a quick look at the terms of the law. We'll consider what happened after it, its aftermath. And finally, we'll consider its significance. Now, I envisage that all of that will take about 45 minutes or so. So we know where we're going. So, Birr in 697. Early in the summer of the year 697, probably in May, a great gathering of kings, bishops, and abbots, along with their followers and servants, took place in Birr. It was a joint meeting of kings, a Dáil, and of church leaders, a synod. They came together to proclaim a law for the protection of women, children, clerics, and other people who did not bear arms in times of conflict. The law was called the Law of the Innocents, or in the annals, Lex Innocentium, or it's also known as Con Adomnán. The scene is hard to imagine for us today. Birr at that time was an important midland monastic settlement, having been founded by St. Brendan almost 150 years earlier. It was one of many such settlements in the immediate area, including Saorkieran, Clonfert, Clonmacnoise, Gallen, Limonhan, Rahan, Lanally, Durrow, Lorra, Turryglass, Roscrea, Kinnetty, and many more. Now, it is in the nature of a small town and the location of seasonal markets with a church, mill, and tradesmen, with dwellings for laymen and women on the outer verges. The church would have been at the centre, probably where the ruins of the pre-Reformation church still stand in Church Street. Now, you've been to Birr, I gather some of you. You visited the castle. I don't know whether you would have seen that old church. It's on the town side of the castle wall. I don't know, you probably might have seen the Marion Hall going into the castle. It's just a little to the south of the Marion Hall. And that's where we think the old church, the first church, started. We had, we think, a road running north-south through the settlement on the line of the main street today. And we can conjecture that the northern entrance to the settlement would have been in the vicinity of Emma Square, the main street. So that was some idea of what Birr was like at that time. Now, Ireland was very different, of course, in 697 from what it is now. Politically, it was divided into small regional kingdoms. There were well over 100 of these, all ruled by a king. These petty kingdoms were part of a hierarchy of regional kingdoms and provincial kingdoms. There were 5 provinces whose boundaries changed from time to time, but which were in 697 Ulster, which was the north, but confined to the northeast, Munster south, Leinster east, Connaught west, and Meath in the Midlands. While Tara, an ancient ceremonial centre, is in Meath, the dominant provincial king from wherever he came claimed the title King of Tara. This title was hotly contested. It was unusual for the holder of the title to have much real authority over provincial kings. Occasionally, the King of Tara is described in the annals as King of Ireland. Ninchuk Machingasa, King of Tara in 697, is so described. When the kings and clerics came to Birr, they would have been used to attending assemblies of one kind or another, maybe not on a scale as the Birr meeting. Provincial assemblies occurred regularly, and the fair of Chalchu or Teltown, Enoch Chalchan, was held each year at the Festival of Lunacy in early August under the auspices of the King of Tara. Tents and other temporary dwellings were used on these occasions, and we can imagine the countryside all around the monastic settlement of Birr dotted with clusters of such dwellings, standards fluttering, and smoke rising from cooking fires. Paddy, if we could have the first, there we are, we have it up there already. These illustrations are the work of a very talented Birr artist, Caroline Conroy, and they just give some sort of an idea. When you're looking at them, you might notice the clothes that the people are wearing. We did a little bit of a study on what sort of clothes would be worn at that time, and these are intended to be as authentic and realistic as possible. Very, very colorful. The early Irish were very much like colorful clothes, and normally their outer garment was a cloak, a brot, a long garment. And you will see these in our illustrations. So, who was there? Who was in Birr? In answering this question, we do not need to speculate, because a list of names was taken at the time of all those who guaranteed the law. And this list has survived down through the centuries. It is likely that most, if not all, on the list were in Birr in May 697. The list contains 91 names, 51 of whom are laymen, 40 of whom are clerics. The clerics are listed first, headed by Flann of Febble, Sage Bishop of Armagh. Some of the other clerics named, they are the abbots of Emily, Bangor, Clonmacnoise, Lismore, Birr, Derry, Clonfert, etc. There are also clerics from Scotland. Parts of Scotland came within the Irish world at that time, and indeed the law describes itself as a law, quote, for the men of Ireland and Britain. I think it's pretty unique that we were making laws for Britain way back in those days. Generally, it was the other way around in subsequent history. Anyway, Lynchuk Mac Aengus, King of Ireland, heads the list of 51 lay guarantors. It also includes the King of Munster and Ulster, and also the kings of the two Leinsters for some reason or other, and Cailleach Mac Rogalig, King of Connacht, along with many kings of lesser kingdoms. Two kings from Scotland, the King of the Picts, that's northern Scotland, and the King of Scottish Dalriata, western Scotland, are also included. So it was a very substantial, significant gathering of important people. A platform would have been erected at the entrance to the monastic settlement, from which the law would be proclaimed. It is not difficult to imagine these mighty and haughty kings with their entourages arriving at the scene on their richly caparisoned horses, wearing their finest garb and most precious swords and jewellery, intent on impressing their friends and intimidating their enemies. Men of Connacht approaching from the west, from the direction of what is now the Green, the Leinster men coming in from the east through what is now John's Mall, and then the King of Munster leading his many sub-kings up the roadway through the settlement, having descended from High Street and onto Bridge Street, and finally the King of Ireland with his attendants appearing on the hill of Emmet Street and descending down to join the assembled throng. Now, Paddy, if we could have number 2 there, this just is a depiction of the kings arriving in Birr. The kings would swagger, but would be wary as they joined, in many cases, their mortal enemies. Lynchuk, the High King, was not to know that he would meet his death in battle within 8 years at the hands of forces of the elderly Cailleach, King of Connacht. Many others would meet the same fate at the hands of fellow attendees at the great meeting in Birr. But first, they had a law to pass, a law by which they all agreed that whatever violence they might inflict on one another, innocents, that is, women, children, and clerics, would be excluded from their wars and would have full legal protection. Thus is set the scene for the greatest day in the history of Birr. Great not only because of the importance of those attending and the splendour of the occasion, more importantly, because of the nature of the law that was enacted, embodying, as it does, humanitarian principles that underpin present-day international affairs and are a hallmark of modern civilization. Who was responsible for this law? Who conceived of it? Who drafted the law? Who won acceptance for it? Who organized the meeting? And that was, of course, Adomnán of Iona. Now, we can reasonably speculate that Adomnán would have arrived in Birr, having spent some time in the Columban monastery in Durrow on his journey. And he would have lodged within the Birr monastery itself some days before the bulk of the attendees. He would have wanted to oversee preparations for the meeting and would wish to have some time to compose himself and to prepare his address to the gathering. We can imagine him praying in the monastery church as the kings and high clerics gathered expectantly at the entrance of the settlement on, as a quote, the plain of Birr at the confines of the Enail and Munster, as one early source. Well, Paddy, we might have the next. This is our depiction of Adomnán praying. Adomnán is not a well-known figure in Ireland today. except among scholars of early Irish history. He has been overshadowed by his kinsman Columba, whose life history he wrote. Adomnán was the 9th Abbot of Iona, the monastery off the western coast of Scotland, which was founded by Columba over 100 years earlier, and from which Columba converted much of northern Britain to Christianity. Colum is a common name in Ireland today, and many churches, schools, and sports clubs bear the name of Columba, usually in the form of Columkill. In fact, most of what we know today about Columba is from Adomnán's Life of Columba, a work much studied by scholars. They have been able to glean from it considerable information about its author. Adomnán, in fact, was a man of immense talents and ability, and among academic historians is well known and much admired. One has described him as, quote, one of the leading churchmen in these islands, that is Ireland and Britain, in the first millennium. Such a claim can be made for few figures in history. He was the original millennium man. It has also been said that, quote, in the wide reception of his writings and their enduring quality, Adomnán approaches the authority of a father of the church. You must remember that Ireland at the time was an important centre of learning in the context of Western Europe. Much of continental Europe had been devastated by what has been referred to as the barbarian invasions. This also applied to the island of Britain, which had only recently been converted to Christianity. In contrast, Ireland had preserved and expanded Christianity, along with its accompanying learning since the time of St. Patrick's arrival in 432. Many of the new Christians in Britain and Western Europe looked to Ireland for instruction in their religion, as well as in such subjects as Latin, rhetoric, grammar, geometry, physics, and computus. Computus is how to calculate the date of Easter. They saw the new religion, Christianity, as the key to the meaning of their existence and the means to their eternal salvation. They came here to the place where this new knowledge could be acquired in its monastic schools, which have been likened to medieval universities. Of this, the English historian Bede wrote in 731, quote, "The Irish welcomed them all gladly, gave them their daily food, and also provided them with books to read and with instruction, without asking for any payment." Excuse me. So, Paddy, we'll have the next illustration now, please. Yes, here we have the students attending the monastic schools. Adomnán was a member of the same northern noble family as Columba, and now 9th Abbot of Iona, in succession to Columba, he presided over a confederation of monasteries located all over the northern half of Ireland and Scotland. At a time when senior churchmen were on a par with kings under law, this made him a powerful and influential figure. It so happened that Lynchuk Mac Ingasa, who became king of Tara in 695, belonged to the same kin and was a distant cousin of Adomnán. This confluence of ecclesiastical and secular power was crucial to the success of his plans. Adomnán had already established himself as a recognized diplomat and negotiator. It is thought that King Alfred of Northumbria was educated on Iona during Adomnán's abbacy, and it is known that they were friends. In the 680s, they met in Northumbria shortly after Alfred's accession to the throne, when Adomnán travelled there as an ambassador for the then King of Tara on a mission for the freedom of captives who had been taken from Meath in a raid ordered by Alfred's predecessor. The mission was successful, and it is an example of the type of activity that enhanced Adomnán's reputation with the Irish people. It is clear, therefore, that the man on his knees, praying in the church in Birr on that day in May 697, was both practically and intellectually among the European elite of his time. However, there was a great deal more to this man. He had a particular passion and a burning determination that, we shall see, was unique to himself, not shared by any of his contemporaries either in Ireland or elsewhere in Western Europe, and not indeed was it evident in anybody else until many centuries after his death. It is clear from his writings that Adomnán abhorred violence against unarmed people, what today we would call non-combatants, or civilians, or what Adomnán called innocents. This word comes from the Latin nocere, meaning to hurt, or innocere, for those who do not hurt. In general, it is women to clerics and anybody else who traditionally did not bear arms. In his Life of Columba, Adomnán devotes 4 chapters to stories about evil men who use violence against innocents. For instance, the heading to one of his chapters is again concerning another persecutor of innocents. He depicts Columba as a protector and avenger of innocents. Columba is particularly outraged by violence against them, and he causes the offenders to suffer the most severe penalties. Scholars see this as reflecting Adomnán's own attitude to violence against innocents. What makes this remarkable is the total absence of similar attitudes appearing in the writings of other Irish authors at the same period. 2 accounts of the lives of St. Patrick and 2 of St. Bridget were written around the same time as Adomnán wrote the Life of Columba. Concern for innocence appears in none of them. We will see that Adomnán's concern is unique, not only in the Irish context, but also in the wider Western European context, and not only in the context of his own time, but in the context of European history, both before and for many centuries after. We have to consider, why was it that Adomnán had this unusual concern? It is clear from the sources that the Ireland of his day was a violent society. The annals for the years leading up to 697 record many incidents of killings, battles, sieges, burnings, laying waste, storming, slaughters, engagements, and skirmishes. In general, however, they do not pick out the involvement of innocents in these incidents. This probably reflects society's lack of awareness and lack of concern for their plight. In recent years, archaeologists have unearthed female remains dating from shortly before the law, showing evidence of brutal wounds inflicted by swords and other weapons. In fact, the archaeologists speculate in one particular instance that the woman was being held down and her attacker was stabbing her in the face, and she was trying to turn her head from side to side to avoid the stabs. It would be naive to think that this sort of violence was not widespread. Adomnán would not have gone to the trouble of introducing his law and winning acceptance for it if it was not necessary. Some later sources suggested that women were used in battle almost as a type of cannon fodder. There is no evidence of this, and it is now discounted by scholars. There is evidence, however, that Adomnán may have had a traumatic personal experience of violence towards innocents that impelled him to act for their protection. One source, although not considered to be factually reliable, describes how Adomnán and his mother Ronat arrived at the aftermath of a battle in Meath, where scenes of the most awful violence are encountered. Quote, "Of all they saw on the battlefield, they saw nothing which they found more touching or more wretched than the head of a woman lying in one place and her body in another, and her infant on the breast of her corpse. There was a stream of milk on one of his cheeks and a stream of blood on the other cheek." While this may not have happened in precise detail, it has been suggested that this represents a tradition that Adomnán was inspired by a personal experience to introduce his law. This has been likened to the experience of Henri Dunant at the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino in 1859, one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century, which led him to found the International Committee of the Red Cross, the present guardians of civilians during warfare. We will never know whether Adomnán had a Solferino moment, but it seems likely that only a personal, shocking experience can explain his singular passion and determination on behalf of innocence. And Paddy, we could have the next one there. And this is just a depiction of innocents being slaughtered. Now, we come now to the law. We can speculate that Adomnán would have included Saint Brendan of Birr, along with Columba, among the saints whose intercession he sought, that God would guide and support him as he prepared to address the assembled dignitaries. The Columban community had a special regard for Birr and its founder, Brendan. Adomnán would therefore have felt a closeness to Brendan and to Birr as he rose slowly from his knees and headed up towards the meeting place. We can allow ourselves to imagine this man of about 70 years pausing to take a drink of water that had been drawn from the very same well, now known as St. Brendan's Well, that can be seen today in the grounds of Birr Castle. And Paddy, we could have the next slide, please. You were in Birr Castle, and the well, I don't know whether you saw the well or not, but it is, when you face Birr Castle, you see to the right the suspension bridge. And just over the suspension bridge, and a little bit to the left, that's where the well is located. He would have proceeded with his determination reinforced by his recollection of the horrific scenes of the battle, and fortified by his prayers, firmly believing that Columba and Brendan were interceding with God for the success of his mission. We can speculate too that his host, the Abbot of Birr, would have escorted Adomnán up onto the platform. He would also be accompanied by assistants, one of whom would be carrying a book with the text of the law inscribed, and would have the task of reading it out to the assembly. Probably the leading churchmen and kings would already be on the platform, including the sage bishop of Armagh and the King of Ireland and the provincial kings. The first paragraph of the law, which we can imagine may have been read out by Adomnán himself, sets out the intention of the law, in many ways like the preamble to a modern Irish statute. The law was written in Old Irish. It is worth quoting an English translation of that first paragraph. Quote, "This is the enactment of the law of Adomnán in Ireland and in Britain. the immunity of the Church of God with her familia and her insignia and her sanctuaries, and all the property, animate and inanimate, and her law-abiding laymen, with their legitimate spouses who abide by the will of Adomnán and a proper, wise, and holy conscience. The enactment of the law of Adomnán enjoins a perpetual law for clerics and females and innocent youths until they are capable of killing a person and of taking their place in the tribe, and until their first armed conflict is known. When these words rang out across the plain of Birr, it was the first legislative expression in the history of Western Europe of the concept of innocence and their rights in times of conflict. Before specifying crimes and penalties, this paragraph sets out the objective of the law. It is to provide immunity from violence for stated classes of persons, namely clerics and females, innocent youths until they reach manhood, along with lay people, presumably penitents, who are subject to a confessor, all of which were people who did not bear arms, and also, of course, church property. The paragraph explains and indeed defines the meaning of the term innocence. As we will see, it is not again until the Geneva Conventions in 1949 that the concept of the non-combatant is so clearly and explicitly defined. The law goes on to do what it said it was going to do. Subsequent sections legislate against the wounding and killing of each of the categories and specify the penalties to be applied to offenders. Substantial fines are to be paid that are not linked to the status in society of the injured person, as was the case under the old under Brehon law. Penalties for killing or wounding a commoner were as severe as for a lord. All women and young men were put on an equal footing as free men under the law. This was revolutionary, and as in efforts for female equality in modern times, is said to have met with stern opposition. In general, fines were to be paid to the kin of innocents who were killed, but in the case of women, they were to be paid to the Adomnán's community, thus bringing them in a particular way under his protection. The law establishes special judges to adjudicate in cases coming under its provisions and goes into detail on how it will operate in practice. This was no token gesture, but a comprehensive and determined effort by Adomnán to right a serious injustice in his society. And now we can have the next, ready, please. Adomnán proclaims the law. So now we will come to the aftermath, what happened afterwards. As the tents were unfolded, temporary dwellings dismantled and the fires extinguished, all were aware that the raids, skirmishes, killings, and wars would continue. When the kings mounted their horses and bade farewell to friend and foe, none were under any illusion that an era of peace had dawned. They were aware that the law that had been agreed only concerned a limitation on how wars were to be fought and not on warfare itself. The modern distinction in international law between jus ad bellum, that is the right to go to war, and jus in bello, that is right conduct during war, had not yet been articulated and would not be for many centuries. Adomnán, however, implicitly makes this distinction out of concern for innocence and recognizing the probable futility of an ad bellum law. The obvious question asked by all when they first hear of the law of the innocents is, how effective was it? Did it succeed in its objective, provide protection for innocents in times of conflict? Unfortunately, it is a question that the sources do not allow us to answer with any degree of certainty. The annals are no more informed for the years after 697 than were for the years before, with only occasional references to the killing of innocents. One such reference is an entry in 814, where mention is made of a raid south of the river Suck, where, quote, very many innocent people were killed. End of quote. This appears to indicate an awareness of the predicament of innocence, but we can't draw any real conclusion from it. Unfortunately, the results of legal judgments were not recorded at this time, and this would apply to judgments made in cases brought under the law of the innocents. Another complicating factor is the intrusion into Irish affairs of foreign invaders, first the Vikings within 100 years of the passing of the law, and then the Anglo-Normans in 1169. It is unlikely that the operation could survive this disruption. But the law was not forgotten. In ensuing centuries after this enactment, it is mentioned regularly in the sources. Generally, it is referred to as a law for women, or for women and children, rather than as a law for innocents, including clerics. This is because Armagh wrested responsibility for clerics from Iona within 40 years of 697 as part of changing political circumstances. In a poem dating from around 830, Adomnán is credited as having won, quote, the lasting freedom of the women of the Gaels, end of quote. An interesting annal entry for the year 927 refers to the death of the Bishop of Derry, who is described as a steward of Adomnán's law, which seems to indicate that the law was operational at that stage. In the period around the year 1000, there appears to have been a revival of active interest in the law, particularly centred on the monastery of Raphoe, County Donegal. Excuse me. Preface was added to the text of the law, which now forms part of the only two surviving copies of the law, both of which copies were made from a manuscript now lost, known as the Old Book of Raphoe. One of those copies was made by Micheál O'Clery, the leader of the Four Masters, who compiled the Annals of the Four Masters in the 1630s. In fact, we know from surviving correspondence that O'Clery discussed his copy with Flann MacEgon of the lawyer family of Redwood Castle, Lara, near Nina, over the winter of 1628-29, and it is likely that he had the copy with him in the castle at the time. It is now housed in the Bibliothèque Royale in Brussels. The second copy in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, is housed in the Bodleian. It cannot be said of many laws that their terms were discussed by lawyers almost 1,000 years after they were drawn up. We can imagine the scene in Redwood Castle on a cold winter's night. The two men drawn close to the fire in the great hall, poring over MacEgon's manuscripts and checking them against O'Clery's handwritten note, in which he had written out a copy of the law. Both were aware that the old order in Ireland was on the point of collapse. Within 20 years, Redwood Castle was an abandoned ruin. The country was being settled by English adventurers, whose aim was to make Ireland British, and who had little regard for all things Irish. In fact, O'Clery had been sent back to Ireland by his superiors, who were exiled in Belgium, to copy and save as much of Gaelic written culture as he could before it was released. In that task, he was remarkably successful, and as a result of his efforts, much was saved for posterity. On that winter's evening, in an Ireland riven by conflict, these two men met in a castle near the swollen banks of River Shannon to discuss the finer points of a law for the protection of innocents, enacted 930 years before, so that those who came after them would know of it and of its terms, and would even perhaps celebrate it. And we can have now Paddy, the last of those, and that's the fiction of the two men. Micheál O'Clery was a Franciscan brother, and then MacEgan was a lawyer, his family having been lawyers for many centuries. On the law's significance. The concept of the non-combatant civilian innocent and his or her right to protection in time of war is a fundamental principle of our modern civilization. The reason why the law of innocence is of huge significance is because it is the first time in the history of Western rule that this concept was articulated and expressed in law. Some people will doubt that this could be true. They might say that surely the ancient Greeks or Romans or the early Christians or the fathers of the church, like St. Augustine at his Just War theories, would have come up with something similar. They didn't, as a close reading of the relevant writings will show. In general, early writers, saints, philosophers in this field were obsessed with the question of when it was right to go to war, jus ad bellum, to the exclusion of the question of what was right behavior during the course of war, jus in bello. It was felt that if your cause was just, you had a free hand. This continued to be the dominant view right up and into the 1800s, with some tentative exceptions in the 1600s and 1700s. With Dunant's experience of the aftermath of the Battle of Solferino and the establishment of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Lieber Code during the American Civil War, things gradually changed. It was not until the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 and additional protocols of 1977 that the rights of innocents in time of war, regardless who had justice on their side, were guaranteed under international law. It took two disastrous world wars in which millions of innocents were slaughtered before the international community agreed, as was agreed in Birr 697, that innocents had an unconditional right to protection. We are all aware that violence towards innocents is an appalling problem in today's world. It is a deliberate feature of many current wars. Their suffering in Bosnia, Syria, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Yemen, etc., are just examples. Putin's Russian invasion of Ukraine heightened that awareness acutely for many of us. The daily images of gratuitous violence and barbarity directed deliberately at innocents appalled us and put our law of the innocents in a special perspective. The importance for our modern civilization of its successor, current international humanitarian law, is apparent. The task of those in the Red Cross and others trying to enforce the rule of international law seems overwhelming. It is important to let those working in the field know that jus in bello, their task, has a history. They should know that in 7th century Ireland, an effort like theirs was made by a remarkable and enlightened man with a passionate concern for the weak and vulnerable. In all societies and at all times, there will be violence towards the defenseless. Fair-thinking people must continue to strive in the knowledge that they will be successful in limiting its effects. it is important to give them encouragement, and it is hoped that this study will do so. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jim, for an excellent exposition of what the Lex Innocentium is all about. I'm very conscious that we have a number of people, both members and friends and others present this evening. And so it's to give Jim a chance to gather his breath and perhaps have a glass of water. And St. Brendan's well. A different St. Brendan from the one who found America, I think you'll find he's St. Brendan of Birr. So he's your patron saint. But I'd just like to show you a few pictures which might interest people and give a little perspective from the Irish-Hellenic point of view of Birr. As I say, we were there on the 18th of June this year, and let's just look first of all at a most remarkable artifact. One of those attending is Colm O'Houlihan from Fan on the Inishowen Peninsula. Colm, would you like to say a few words about if you unmute, would you like to tell us a little bit about the importance of this?
Yeah, it's a cross slab, as you can see, and it dates from the 7th century. And the unique thing about it is if you can turn the model around a little bit, there's on one of the edges, on the northern edge, I think there is a Greek inscription, which is of the Gloria. I think that's
yes, in Greek, in fact, what it says, Colm, is doxa, which means glory.
Yeah.
Timi, it's spelled T-I-M-E, but it's actually timi, which means honor.
Yeah.
And then it says patri, to the Father, ke io, and to the Son, ke pneumati aio, and to the Holy Spirit. The spelling is not always perfect, but the meaning is quite clear.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. We've been involved in the conservation of the cross now for about 6 or 7 years, and it's very accessible. It's along a very busy main road, and there's car parking beside it. And then it's the main road between Derry and Buncrana. And anybody that's in the area, if you stop off, the writing now the lettering isn't clear, but actually the inscription is quite visible. The pictures you show are from the Discovery program, which has been a laser image of the cross, and the writing is actually very clear on that. So it has.
It's kind of sheltered under the wing of the cross, so to speak.
Yeah. I'm I'm more of a conservationist than a historian, but I've always been fascinated as to how this inscription arrived in on the shores of Lough Swilly.
Yes. One of the I would commend to all of you watching this wonderful book by my former professor of Greek in Trinity, W.B. Stanford. He was the Regius Professor of Greek for 40 years, and then he was the Chancellor of the University of Dublin. But he wrote this wonderful book, Ireland and the Classical Tradition, while I was a student in his room in number 14 Trinity College. And if you look at the first few pages, and indeed the very first entry in the index, it's about Adomnán of Iona. And Adomnán has a very, very high chance of being somebody who knew Greek. And you may say, Paddy, you're pulling me leg, but actually not so, because there was a knowledge of Greek in Ireland. It may not have been very deep, but certainly one of Adomnán's fellow Irishman, how do we know he was Irish? Eugena, because his name was Johannes Scotus Eugena, John the Irishman from Ireland. I think he was definitely carrying an Irish passport. And he was, apart from the Vatican librarian at the time, one of only 2 people in Western Europe who had a really, really excellent knowledge of Greek. But I think it is astonishing, and thank you very much, Colm, that there is an inscription from somewhere around the year 750, maybe a little bit after the coin Adomnán. All right, in the Inishowen Peninsula. Sorry, Colm.
Yeah. Could I just add that the pronunciation of Adomnán. Now, it's, if you put a hitch, A-D-H-O-M-H, it becomes Aonan. And it's Unan, which is quite a common forename in Inishowen. As a number, I know a number of women whose name is Ronit, which I didn't know was his mother. So it's still that the tradition has survived. It's, you have St. Eunan's Cathedral in Letterkenny and so on and so forth. So that's just an extra bit.
Yes, yes. If people like to go in, on this particular software, I can't actually rotate that cross column. I would love to rotate the cross to show you the Greek inscription, but I'm not able to do it in this particular software. But if you go into the Discovery program, by the way, the first person who directed the Discovery program was George Ogan, who was a patron of the Irish-Hellenic Society, who died a year ago. He was living in Brighton Road in Rathgar, just down the road from where I am here in Terranure. Thank you very, very much, Colm. And I urge people to go and see the Fahanmore cross, which is just, as Colm says, it's on the west side of the Inishowen Peninsula, and it's an object of great beauty. And I think there are also actually replicas, jewelry, beautiful works of jewelry made based on that cross. Would anybody else, perhaps, if anybody else would like to ask a question or make a comment on what Jim has been saying? This is just some pictures. I think these are in Raphoe. Perhaps you might be able to confirm, Colm, that this is St. Adomnán in Raphoe. I think it is. I've just taken these down from the internet.
May I ask a question?
Please.
I don't know if our speaker knows now, but what is the situation with international law now by comparison to what he described? Is it a UN decision, and all the governments, all the nations have to accept it, or what exactly is the situation now?
Jim, would you like to answer that? I think the answer is it's the Fourth Geneva Convention, which you mentioned.
Yes, the whole question of civilians in warfare is governed by the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 and Protocol of 1977. And I think nearly every country has joined in that and are bound by it. And if you're just looking for examples of what is not allowed, well, they're happening every day in Ukraine at the moment, because the Russians are violating the Geneva Convention, totally ignoring it. And of course, I mean, to be fair, a lot of others have done it too. The Americans did it in Vietnam, and but just currently, what is happening is that the Russians are doing it, and hopefully the authorities, who are probably better now at gathering evidence, will ultimately be able to bring some of these perpetrators to court. And there are some people, of course, in court as a result of being convicted, including some of the people involved in the Yugoslavian situation. I can't quite remember their names now, but some of these people are in jail. In other words, justice is being done. And one would hope that we will always strive to make these people accountable for these crimes.
We're just looking, Jim, at a picture of Iona. Would you like to say a few words? Which I understand you visited the island of Iona, which is off the west of the Isle of Mull in Scotland.
Yes, yes. I did, although quite a long time ago now, but it's certainly approaching it now from the land. I mean, I know we drove up and took the ferry over from Larne, and it was all quite a journey, and it seemed extremely remote. But of course, that is wrong, because it wasn't all that remote, because people traveled on the sea. The sea was a highway, and actually the land, in on the land was more difficult to cross than the sea in a lot of cases. So Iona was in quite a, not exactly in the center of everything, but certainly wasn't at all as remote as it might appear. It was the center of huge developments, and I mean, Book of Kells and all this sort of stuff. It was a wonderful jewel in our history, really.
Thank you, Jim, for a very interesting talk. I noticed that Maureen Nichoncha is in the audience tonight, and Maureen, of course, wrote about the guarantor list many years ago, the list of those who signed their names to the coin. Perhaps she might have something to say about some aspects of it.
Maureen, are you with us? You might need to unmute, Maureen, if you are there. She may have left the room. We'll keep an ey out for her.
She's there, but keeping silent.
Ah.
Maureen, sort of, I would say, broke ground, and she was the first really to examine the Con in detail. And certainly I know in my book I mentioned that it obviously wouldn't have been possible at all, but for all the work that Maureen did. She was the pioneer and did wonderful work on the Con.
Well, I have many questions. I was concerned about what empowered this meeting to change the way in which battle was done, and women were excluded. They didn't all just come together with one great mind. At that time, somebody had to be the political power behind the law being established. And those laws were not so much like laws we see today. They were more like, this is what you're supposed to do, and you would be dishonored if you don't do this. Like if you don't pay your fine, if you don't make restitution, then you'll be shunned. Or so I'm trying to get a really good feel for why that particular time all these kings and different power groups got together and established this one law. Is there an underlying reason for that?
I think the biggest factor was Adomnán and his personality and his authority, and what was ever driving him to do it, because he was the one who conceived of it, and he was the one who drew up the actual terms of the law. And of course, it was done then with the authority of the King of Ireland. And they were able to persuade, I don't know how reluctantly or otherwise, but they were able to persuade the other kings to subscribe to it. And I suppose there was a lot of moral persuasion. I don't know, but they were able to do that, and I think the main credit goes to obviously to Adomnán.
Oh, so he's the inheritor of Columba, and
Yeah.
he had the respect of everyone in the Gaelic world at that time. It's
absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So
very much so.
Well, that's pretty awesome. Thank you.
He's pretty awesome, and he was a pretty awesome man, and not well enough known in Ireland or appreciated or understood at all. And he allowed, he was really instrumental in making Columba, allowing Columba to overshadow him, because he wrote all about Columba, and we know all about Columba because of what he wrote. But unfortunately, he has been somewhat overlooked, certainly in the general public, but not by scholars. I think scholars are very much better.
Mm-hmm. So did this law change the role of women greatly? I mean, it appeared to me from reading the law, and it said that women would fight in the battles just like men, and I got the impression that there was the women fighting the women and the men fighting the men in general. And a man fought a woman like that, he'd be taking a big risk. So did that undermine their role in the society, or did it establish a whole different role?
No, it's we have to be very careful when we're reading the law, because the law is a compilation of, there was, in my book, I attempt to isolate what was the original law and what was added on over the years. And a lot of this stuff about women fighting and all that sort of thing was added on maybe 300 years after Adomnán's law, and incorporated into the copies of the law that we now have. But I think scholars generally discount this business about women being involved in battles and fighting and all that sort of thing, that there's no real evidence for that.
Well, the Roman accounts on the continent about the Celts, and they would have battle, and Romans would say they were routing the men, but when they got to the wagons, that the wives of the Celtic men would bow up their necks and start bringing the battle back to them, and they were afraid to do battle with them because it would be, they would lose face. Here the mighty Roman armed legion is fighting women and getting beat. So
well, weren't they dead right too?
Yes.
Jim,
and these are Irish women, so we know that.
Yeah, exactly.
One step up on
one
that.
has to beware. Yes.
Sorry, Jim, could I come in again? You jumped more or less from the 7th century right through to the 20th century. Would you like to comment on the movement for in the 11th century, 10th, 11th centuries, but particularly the 11th century, the peace and truth, the peace and, I've forgotten the thing.
The Peace of God movement. The Peace of God movement.
Yes, and truth, which was actually an attempt to
it was
rein in the violence of that society.
It was.
In Western Europe generally.
Yes, I deal with all that actually in my book, and the Peace of God movement in particular is seen as a stepping stone along the way to the proper, we'll say, treatment of civilians. And now I've looked at some of their ordinances, and they vary quite a lot. This was a movement, I think, in south mid France most to a large extent, where they were finding that the soldiers, the military people, were attacking women and travelers and all sorts of unarmed, defenseless people, and they got fed up with it, and they passed these laws trying to limit it as best they could. And then the Truth of God movement came, and unfortunately that was hijacked to some extent because the church more or less said it was a most outrageous thing that Christians were fighting one another, and they'd be much better off to go off and fight against the heathens, and thus in the Crusades, where most atrocious things were done to the native Islamic people, but it was seen as being actually most of our God's work to do that sort of thing. So that's how that developed then. But it was a step in the right direction, we'll say, initially at any rate.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? If not, I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Jim Houlihan, for taking the time this evening to talk to us about the Lex Innocentium. This talk has been recorded and will be in the next few days put up on our YouTube channel, the channel of the Irish-Hellenic Society. Thank you very, very much, Jim, for a wonderful talk, and thank you to all of you who joined us this evening from various parts of Ireland and I think elsewhere, and for contributing to making this a most interesting evening. I would just like to say a few words to give a perspective from the point of view of the Irish-Hellenic Society as to the importance of this law. Over the last year or so, I've been teaching modern Greek using a book called Ellinika Yassas, Greek for You. And in the first few pages of it, the authors state that the book was tried out in, among other places, the State Humanitarian University of Mariupol in the Ukraine. Not a city I was familiar with. I never heard the name previously. It was a city, and I speak in the past tense, it was a city of 400,000 people. The State Humanitarian University of Mariupol was the center in the Ukraine for Greek studies, modern Greek and ancient Greek, and it had received a lot of assistance from the government of Greece and from the government of Cyprus and from the Levendis Foundation, now based in Switzerland, but with Cypriot and very big Greek connections. It no longer exists. The university has been physically wiped out. And any teaching that is done is now being done from Kyiv. That is a very sobering fact for us. We take our meetings of the Irish-Hellenic Society as something for granted, that the lights will be on, that people will be able to drink water while they're speaking, and that there will be some heat, maybe in the form of electricity. None of those things is true for the people in Mariupol today. And Jim also mentioned to me, for example, that the city of Kherson also features. Kherson is simply a Greek word short for Chersonisos, meaning peninsula. Mariupol, of course, is the city of Maria. Polis is the Greek word for a city, so Mariupol is the city of Maria. That whole area of Ukraine was, its medieval history was written in Byzantine Greek. It's a very, very Greek place, and we must salute the people in that area for what they have suffered and what they are still suffering, and we express our solidarity with them. During the last summer, a number of artists in Ireland came together and produced a lovely CD which has been recorded by Farpoint Recordings. And Anthony Kelly has very kindly given me the picture which you can see on your screen. And if you're interested in supporting these artists, all of the proceeds from their work goes to the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross. So if you're interested in that, if you just Google the words Farpoint recording, you will be able to contribute. Thank you all for being with us this evening, and we look forward to those of you to seeing those of you who are coming to our annual lunch, which is in the Royal St. George Yacht Club on Sunday, the 27th of this month. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you all very, very much, and good night.